Brazilian cinema was introduced early in the 20th century but took some time to consolidate itself as a popular form of entertainment. The film industry of Brazil has gone through periods of ups and downs, a reflection of its dependency on state funding and incentives. History. Early days. A couple of months after the Lumiere brothers' invention, a film exhibition was held in Rio de Janeiro. As early as 1898, the Italian Afonso Segreto supposedly filmed the Guanabara from the ship Brasil on a return journey from Europe, though some researchers question the veracity of this event as no copy of the film remains. He would go on to make documentaries with his brother Pascal Segreto. An ad of a May 1987 issue of Gazeta de Petrópolis, as shown in 1995 by Jorge Vittorio Capellaro and Paulo Roberto Ferreira, was introduced as the new birth certificate of Brazilian cinema, as 3 short films were advertised: Chegada de Trem em Petrópolis, Bailado de Crancas no Colégio de Andaraí and Ponto Terminal da Linha dos Bons de Botafogo, Vendo os Passageiros Uberidusca. During this belle époque of Brazilian cinema, when black and white silent films were less costly to produce, most work resulted from the effort of passionate individuals willing to take on the task themselves rather than commercial enterprises. Neither is much attention given by the state, with legislation for the sector being practically non-existent. Film theaters only become larger in number in Rio and São Paulo late in the following decade, as power supply becomes more reliable. Foreign films as well as short films documenting local events were most common. Some of the first fictional work filmed in the country were the so-called posed films, reconstitutions of crimes that had recently made the press headlines. The first success of this genre is Francisco Marzulo's Os Estranguladores. Sung films were also popular. The actors would hide behind the screen and dub themselves singing during projection. During the 1920s, film production flourished throughout several regions of the country: Recife, Campinas, Cataguases, Juiz de Fora and Garanhuns. Hollywood films were also extremely popular during this time, accounting for as much as 85% of film material being exhibited on Brazilian screens in 1928. That year, an estimated 16,464,000 linear feet of film was exported to Brazil, making it Hollywood's third largest foreign market. European films, mostly from Germany and France, were also exhibited with relative frequency. Fan magazines like Cinearte and A Cine Muda were published during this time, featuring both domestic and Hollywood films and stars. 1930s and 1940s. Mario Pisotto's Limite was poorly received by audiences but eventually regarded as masterpiece of the silent film era. Along with Humberto Moro's Ganga Bruta, Cinedia was founded by Adhemar Gonzaga in 1930 and was dedicated to the production of popular dramas and burlesque musical comedies, a genre which was negatively referred to as chanchada. The chanchada would often include satires of Hollywood movies. Actress Carmen Miranda gained visibility overseas. In 1946, Gilda de Abreu Ebrio, a film very much representative of typical Latin melodrama, became a major hit and drew in around 4 million viewers. President Getulio Vargas became aware of film's growth and, in 1939, created a decree that guaranteed Brazilian films an exhibition quota in film theaters, a law which still exists, though it is now largely ignored due to lack of proper control. While Vargas' decree may be seen as a positive and nationalistic measure, it has also been interpreted as a means of state control and intervention. Atlântida. During the 40s and 50s, films produced by the Atlântida Cinematográfica peaked and attracted large large audiences by continuing with chanchadas. Among the actors that became strongly associated with Atlantida who had previously worked in Cinedia films are Oscarito, a comedian somewhat reminiscent of a Harpo Marx and commonly cast as lead, and Grande Othello, who usually had a smaller supporting role and is often Oscarito's sidekick. José Lugoy was commonly cast as a villain, while Zeddy Acute Macedo often took on the role of the underside nagging wife. The films of this period have often been brushed aside as being overly commercial and Americanized, though by the 70s a certain amount of revisionism sought to restore its legitimacy. Despite being overlooked by intellectual elites, these films attracted large audiences as none of the Cinema Novo films would achieve. Today, the telenovela, especially the novela das sete, is sometimes identified as carrying on the spirit of the chanchada. Many of the films produced by the company have been lost throughout the years due to fire and flooding of its storage facilities. Veracruz. The Cinematográfica Veracruz is a production company founded during the 40s and most notable for its output during the following decade. It is in this period that Lima Barreto's Clásico Cangaceiro is produced. The movement was named after the large production studio. American genre films were popular in Brazil and filmmakers began emulating them. The Western and the detective film were particularly popular. The desire to create Americanesque films led to the creation of large-scale Hollywood-style studios. These films were highly commercialized, which led some directors to begin experimenting with independent cinema. This movement away from commercialized Veracruz-style films came to be called Cinema Novo, or New Cinema. Veracruz eventually bankrupted and closed. Cinema Novo, the Italian neorealism, followed later in the 60s by the French New Wave, fueled a new kind of modernistic and experimental cinema across the globe. In Brazil, this tendency was carried out by its own new wave movement, the Cinema Novo. Glauber Rocha, a very political filmmaker from Bahia, quickly became the most notable director, often held as leader of the movement. His work possesses many allegorical elements, strong political critique and an impeccable mise-en-scene that were readily embraced by intellectuals. Rocha often spoke of his films as being a departure from what he considered to be the colonizer's view, to whom poverty was an exotic and distant reality, as well as the colonized who regarded the Third World status as shameful. He sought to portray misery, hunger and the violence they generate, and thus suggest the need for a revolution. Deus e o Diabo na Terra do Sol and Terra M Trans are some of his most famous works. Other key directors of the movement include Nelson Pereira dos Santos, Rigueira and Carlos Diegues. Freedom to express political views becomes scarce as the 1964 Brazilian coup d'etat takes place and repression increases over the following years, forcing many of these artists into exile. B films. A marginal cinema emerges associated with the Boca de Lixo area in São Paulo. In 1968, Rogério Swanzerla releases O Bandido da Luz Vermelha, a story based on an infamous criminal of the period. The following year, Julio Bressans Killed the Family and Went to the Movies came out, a story in which the protagonist is exactly what is described by the title. Marginal cinema of this period is sometimes also referred to as underground, a mocking of the English word underground. Also popular was Zeddy Acute, the screen alter ego of actor and horror film director José Mahi Camarões. Associated with the genre is also the porno chanchada, a popular genre in the 1970s. As the name suggests, these were sex comedies, though they did not depict sex explicitly. One key factor as to why these marginal films thrived was that film theaters were obliged to obey quotas for national films. Many owners of such establishments would finance low-budget films, including those of pornographic content. Though the country was under dictatorship, censorship tended to be more political than cultural. That these films thrived could be perceived by many as a cause of embarrassment. Yet they managed to draw in enough audiences so as to stay on the market consistently throughout those years. 1970s and 1980s. Films in this period benefited from state-run agencies, most notably Embra Film. Its role was perceived as somewhat ambiguous. It was criticized for its dubious selection criteria, bureaucracy and favoritism, and was seen as a form of government control over artistic production. On the other hand, much of the work of this period was produced mainly because of its existence. A varied and memorable filmography was produced, including Arnaldo Jaba's adaptation of Nelson Rodriguez's All Nudity Shall Be Punished, Carlos Digas' Bye Brazil, Hector Babenco's Pahote and Nelson Pereira dos Santos' Memoirs of Prison. One of the most successful films in Brazilian film history is an adaptation of Jorge Amado's Dona Flor and Her Two Husbands by Bruno Barreto. A peak in the number of film theaters is reached in 1975, when 3,276 projection rooms were in existence. Brazilian films sold a total of 275.4 million tickets the same year. Retomada and contemporary cinema. The early 90s, under the Collor government, saw a significant decrease in state funding that led to a practical halt in film production and the closing of Embra Film in 1989. However, in the mid-90s the country witnessed a new burst in cinematic production, mainly thanks to the introduction of incentive laws under the new FHC government. The comedy Carlota Joaquina, Princess of Brazil, came out in 1995 and is held by many as the first film of the Retomada, or the return of national film production. Since then there have been films with Academy Award nominations such as O Quatrilho, 4 Days in September, Central Station and City of God. The dark urban film O Invasão was chosen as the best film of the period by magazine Revista de Cinema. Some other films that have attracted attention are Carandiero, O Home que Copiava, Madame Sata, Abril Despedacado, Olga and Os Filhos de Francisco. Though perhaps some of these would no longer qualify as films of the Retomada, since the term is only adequate to describe the initial boost that occurred in the 90s. Still common in Brazilian cinema is a taste for social and political criticism, a trait that reflects its strong cinema novo influences. Poverty, favelas, drought and famine are themes so common that the term cosmética da fome, or hunger cosmetic, was coined as a way to criticize its supposed exhaustion if not exploitation. For the common moviegoer, there has been a shift in perception towards Brazilian cinema as becoming more audience-friendly. Television shows of the Rede Globo network such as Casseta and Amp, Planeta and Os Nor may have also received film versions, and Globo Films, Globo's film production branch, has been behind many of the films that have come out over the years, often as a co-producer. Globo's presence is seen by some critics as being overly commercial, thus compelling certain filmmakers to work outside its system to create independent work. Documentaries have also had strong place in Brazilian cinema thanks to the work of renowned directors such as Eduardo Coutinho and João Moreira Salles. In 2007, the film Tropa Elite gained headlines due to how quickly pirate DVD copies spread among viewers before its release on theaters, but also due to the large number of audience members who cheered police brutality scenes. Its depiction of drug users as crime sponsors also fueled debates on the legalization of drugs. Domestic market. Since the 1970s, the quantity of film theaters has declined heavily. During the 1990s, it became common for small theaters to close, while multiplex theaters, which are usually found in shopping centers, gained market share. In the last decades, the accessibility of television sold at lower prices combined with Reed Globo's success in making telenovelas of high production quality made cinema less attractive to lower-income audiences. In addition, ticket prices increased more than tenfold in a span of 20 years. In the early 1990s, Brazilian film production suffered as a result of Collor's laissez-faire policy. The sector had depended on state sponsorship and protection. However, with the retomada, Brazilian film regained speed, though not to the same extent it had seen before. A significant increase in audience was recorded, however, from 2000 to 2002, with 7 million viewers, to 2003, when 22 million viewers came to theaters to watch national films. Because these films were made possible thanks to incentive laws introduced in the 90s, and that the number of viewers drawn in from year to year can fluctuate significantly, it is often questioned whether film production has in fact reached a certain amount of stability, and whether or not it could in the future succumb to any governmental whims. Incentive laws allow Brazilian films to receive funding from companies that, by acting as sponsors, are allowed tax deductions. A common criticism is that, through this system, though films are no longer directly controlled by state, they are, nevertheless, subject to the approval of entrepreneurs who are logically cautious as to which content they wish to associate the brands. Even with funding, there are still areas that require some struggle from filmmakers, such as distribution, television participation and DVD release.